Did they start selling business class to charity cases now? The woman's voice cut through the quiet cabin like a blade wrapped in silk, sharp but polished, loud enough to turn heads without ever raising its pitch. And for a moment, even the low hum of the aircraft's ventilation seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to continue. A ripple of restrained curiosity moving through the rows of wide leather seats as eyes lifted, one by one, toward the source of the remark and then toward the man it was meant for. Marcus Reed, seated by the window with his boarding pass resting neatly against his thigh, his posture straight but unassuming, dressed in a simple navy button-down shirt that bore faint creases from travel and a pair of worn brown shoes that had seen more terminals than attention, his gaze calm, almost distant, as if the comment had arrived from somewhere far away rather than just across the aisle, while the woman, Victoria Caldwell, tilted her head slightly, her diamond bracelet catching the soft overhead lighting and scattering it into cold, fractured reflections across the polished armrest. Her lips curved into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the kind of expression practiced over years of being listened to without question, of existing in spaces where doubt rarely touched her. She adjusted the sleeve of her tailored cream blazer with a small, precise motion, then glanced toward the flight attendant station near the galley, as if expecting silent agreement, her presence filling the air with an unspoken certainty that something was out of place, that the order she understood so well had been disrupted, and that it was her role to correct it. The attendant hesitated, fingers tightening slightly around a tablet, eyes flicking between Marcus and the manifest on the screen, while a man 2 rows back lowered his newspaper just enough to watch, the thin paper rustling softly like a whisper passing judgment. Somewhere a seatbelt clicked, somewhere else a quiet cough broke and then dissolved into the background. But Marcus didn't move, didn't rush to explain or defend. He simply glanced down once at the printed seat number, 2A, as if grounding himself in something tangible, then back out the oval window where the late afternoon sun stretched long across the runway in streaks of amber and gold, his reflection faintly visible against the glass, steady, unshaken, as though he had stood in moments like this before and learned the weight of silence, the way it could hold dignity when words might fracture it. Victoria leaned back slightly, crossing her legs with deliberate elegance, her heel tapping once against the floor in quiet impatience, the sound small but sharp enough to echo in the stillness. And in that suspended space between assumption and truth, between who he appeared to be and who he was, the cabin held its breath without realizing it, waiting for something to shift, though no one yet knew what that shift would cost. Marcus Reed had learned a long time ago that silence could say more than defense, and as the quiet tension stretched across the cabin, he let it settle without resistance, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the armrest, steady and deliberate, the faint texture of worn leather beneath his palm grounding him in the moment while the world around him leaned in closer, waiting for him to react in a way that would confirm what they had already decided about him. But he did not give them that satisfaction. Not with anger, not with explanation, not even with a glance of discomfort. Instead, his eyes drifted briefly to the aisle where the flight attendant now approached with careful steps, her smile polite but strained, the kind that carried uncertainty beneath professionalism, her tablet held close to her chest, as if it might offer protection from the situation unfolding in front of her. And when she stopped beside his seat, there was a pause, small but noticeable, as though even she felt the weight of choosing the next word. "Sir," she began gently, her voice low enough to keep the moment contained yet audible enough to acknowledge it. "May I see your boarding pass?" Marcus nodded once, no hesitation, no offense taken, and handed it to her with a calm that did not seek approval, only clarity, his movements smooth, practiced, as if he had lived through variations of this scene before. The attendant glanced down, her eyes scanning the printed details, then back up at him, then down again, a flicker of confusion crossing her face like a cloud passing over sunlight, and behind her Victoria shifted slightly in her seat, watching with quiet expectation, her expression unchanged, confident in an outcome she believed inevitable, while a few passengers leaned subtly into the aisle, pretending not to stare but failing to look away, the air thick with assumptions that no one dared to say out loud. Marcus noticed none of it in the way they expected, Or perhaps he noticed all of it and chose not to carry it, his attention instead returning to the window where the runway stretched into the distance. Lines of white paint fading into heat waves rising off the asphalt, a place of departure, of movement, of possibility, something deeper than the narrow judgment unfolding behind him, his reflection in the glass steady, composed, untouched by the quiet storm building in the cabin. And when the attendant finally spoke again, her voice softer now, more uncertain than before, there was a subtle shift in the space between them, as if something unseen had begun to change, though no one yet understood what it meant. Victoria Caldwell did not like hesitation, especially not the kind that lingered in front of her, visible in the subtle tightening of the flight attendant's grip and the slight delay in her response. And as the seconds stretched just a fraction too long, Victoria's smile sharpened at the edges, her fingers brushing lightly over the armrest, as if resetting her composure. Her voice calm but edged with quiet authority when she spoke again. "Is there a problem?" she asked, tilting her head just enough to signal expectation rather than curiosity, and the attendant turned slightly toward her, caught between protocol and pressure. "No, ma'am," she replied, though the uncertainty in her tone betrayed her, and that small fracture in confidence did not go unnoticed, not by Victoria, not by the passengers who had now fully abandoned the pretense of privacy, their attention openly fixed on the exchange, and certainly not by Marcus, who remained seated, hands relaxed, posture unchanged, as though the entire moment existed on a different plane from the one he occupied. Yet there was something in his stillness that began to shift the air itself, something subtle but present, like the quiet before a realization that had not yet taken form. Victoria leaned forward slightly now, her bracelet catching the light again, scattering small flashes across the polished surface of the cabin. "Well," she pressed, not louder, but firmer, accustomed to movement following her words, to systems adjusting around her without question, and the attendant glanced once more at the boarding pass, then at the seat number displayed on her tablet, her brows drawing together in a way that suggested something was not aligning the way it should, and for the first time, her attention lingered on Marcus not as a problem to resolve, but as a variable she did not yet understand. "Sir," she said again, softer now, "you are in seat 2A, correct?" Marcus gave a small nod, his voice even when he finally spoke. "That is correct," and there was no challenge in his tone, no need to assert what was already true, only a quiet confirmation that seemed to settle into the space between them, while behind the attendant, Victoria exhaled slowly through her nose, a controlled release of impatience, her gaze flicking briefly toward the overhead compartment, then back to Marcus as if re-evaluating him not with doubt, but with a search for justification, something she might have missed that could still restore the order she expected. But there was nothing obvious to grasp, no visible marker that aligned with her assumptions, and that absence began to irritate her more than the situation itself. The cabin lights hummed softly above, casting a consistent glow that revealed every subtle expression, every glance exchanged between strangers now connected by a shared moment of quiet tension, and somewhere near the front of the plane, a faint click sounded as a door shifted slightly, unnoticed by most, but enough to signal that movement was happening beyond the visible scene, something approaching that would soon redefine the balance in the room, though for now, everything remained suspended in that fragile space between certainty and truth, waiting. The faint click near the front of the aircraft turned into the soft, deliberate sound of a door opening, and while most passengers did not immediately register it, the shift in attention from the flight attendant was unmistakable, her posture straightening just slightly as her eyes lifted past Marcus and toward the aisle ahead, and in that subtle change, something in the atmosphere tightened, as if an invisible thread had been pulled taut across the cabin. Victoria noticed it too, her gaze narrowing for a fraction of a second before she leaned back again, masking curiosity with composure, though her fingers now rested still against her armrest, no longer tapping, no longer signaling control, just waiting, the kind of waiting she was not used to, the kind that did not bend to her presence. Marcus followed the attendant's glance only briefly, not turning fully, just enough to acknowledge movement without seeking it, his calm unchanged, as though whatever was approaching was not a surprise, but a continuation, a moment already accounted for somewhere beyond what anyone else could see. The attendant stepped slightly aside now, creating a narrow path along the aisle, her voice quiet when she spoke again. "Sir, if you would just remain seated for a moment." And the phrasing was different this time. No longer a request for validation, but a quiet recognition that something larger was unfolding. Victoria let out a soft breath, barely audible, her expression tightening as the lack of immediate resolution began to unsettle her. She adjusted the collar of her blazer, smoothing it with precise movements that now felt more habitual than assured, her eyes flicking toward the front once more, searching for clarity, for confirmation, for anything that would restore the balance she believed had been disrupted. And then footsteps, measured and unhurried, echoed softly against the carpeted aisle, drawing every gaze forward in unspoken unison. The figure that emerged was composed, uniform crisp, presence steady in a way that did not demand attention but commanded it nonetheless, the kind of authority that did not need to be announced. And as he moved closer, the subtle murmur of the cabin faded entirely, replaced by a silence that carried weight, that carried anticipation, that carried the quiet realization that whatever came next would not simply resolve the moment, but redefine it. Victoria sat straighter now, her chin lifting slightly, preparing to reclaim control of a situation she still believed she understood, while Marcus remained exactly as he had been, seated, composed, his gaze calm and forward, as if the arrival of this moment was not a disruption, but a return to something already in motion, something inevitable, something that had been approaching long before the first word was spoken. The man in uniform stopped just short of Marcus's row, his presence settling into the space like a quiet authority that did not need introduction, and for a brief second he said nothing, his eyes moving from the flight attendant to the boarding pass still held in her hand, then finally to Marcus himself, and something in his expression shifted, subtle but undeniable, a recognition that passed between them without words, the kind that did not belong to strangers. "Sir," the attendant began, her voice uncertain again. But the man gently raised a hand, not to silence her, but to pause the moment, to let it realign. And when he spoke, his tone was calm, measured, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being heard. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, not directing the question at Marcus, but at the situation itself, and Victoria was the first to respond, leaning slightly into the aisle, her voice smooth but firm. "Yes, there is," she said, her eyes fixed on him with practiced confidence. "This passenger appears to be seated in the wrong section, and your staff seems unable to resolve it." There was a slight emphasis on the word staff, a reminder of hierarchy, of expectation, of where she believed authority should lie. The man listened without interruption, his gaze steady, then shifted back to Marcus, who met his eyes with the same quiet composure he had held from the beginning. No urgency, no defensiveness, just presence. And in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed. Again, something that did not align with the narrative unfolding in the rest of the cabin. The man nodded once, slowly, then turned to the attendant. "May I see the boarding pass?" he asked, and when she handed it over, her fingers lingered just a fraction longer than necessary, as if transferring not just the paper, but the weight of the moment. He glanced down at it, his eyes scanning the details with precision, then back up. And for the first time since he arrived, a faint shift touched his expression, not surprise, not confusion, but something closer to confirmation, as though a question had just been answered. Behind him the cabin remained still, every passenger now openly watching, the quiet hum of the aircraft the only sound that dared to exist. Victoria sat straighter, her chin lifted slightly higher now, waiting for validation, for the correction she believed inevitable, her confidence resting on the assumption that systems would behave as they always had in her favor. But the man did not turn to her immediately. Instead, he looked once more at Marcus, his posture softening just enough to suggest a different kind of acknowledgement, one that did not belong to this moment of conflict but to something larger, something already established. And then he spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough that the silence carried his words to every corner of the cabin. "Sir, I apologize for the delay," he said, and the phrasing alone was enough to fracture the expectation hanging in the air. Victoria's expression flickered, just for an instant, the first crack in her certainty, while the attendant blinked, her grip tightening slightly at her side, and Marcus, still seated, gave the smallest nod, as if accepting something that had never been in question, as if the moment unfolding was not a revelation to him, but to everyone else. And in that fragile second between assumption and truth, the balance in the cabin began to shift, quietly, but completely. Silence did not break after his words. It deepened, settling into the cabin like a soft weight that pressed against every assumption still lingering in the air. And for a moment no one moved, not the passengers leaning into the aisle, not the attendant holding her breath beside them, not even Victoria, whose posture remained upright, but no longer carried the same certainty, her fingers now resting motionless against the armrest as if unsure what action to take next. Marcus remained seated, his gaze drifting once more toward the window where the fading sunlight traced long lines across the wing outside, the glow warm and steady, untouched by the tension behind him. And in that quiet, his presence seemed to expand, rather than shrink, not through force or declaration, but through something far more unsettling to those who had judged him, the absence of reaction, the absence of need to prove anything at all. The man in uniform took a small step back, creating space rather than filling it, his posture no longer investigative but respectful, his hands loosely folded behind him, as if acknowledging a shift that did not require explanation. The attendant glanced between them again, her earlier uncertainty now replaced with something closer to realization, though she did not yet fully understand it. She could feel it, the change in tone, in hierarchy, in the invisible structure that had governed the moment until now. Victoria exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but enough to mark the first visible fracture in her composure. Her eyes moved from Marcus to the man in uniform and back again, searching for clarity, for contradiction, for anything that might restore the version of reality she had entered with. But nothing aligned the way it had before, and that misalignment began to settle into her expression, subtle at first, then undeniable. The cabin lights reflected faintly in the polished surface of her bracelet, no longer sharp or commanding, but softened, almost dimmed, as if even the light itself had shifted with the moment. A child seated across the aisle leaned forward slightly, his small voice whispering to his mother, "Why is everyone so quiet?" And she gently placed a hand on his shoulder, not answering, because there was no simple explanation for what was unfolding, no quick correction, no clear boundary between who belonged and who did not. Marcus adjusted his sleeve slightly, a small, almost absent gesture, then rested his hand again, steady as before, and in that stillness there was something powerful, something that did not need to announce itself to be felt, something that did not demand recognition but revealed it. And as the engines outside began their low, distant rumble, preparing for departure, the moment inside the cabin remained suspended, not unresolved, but transformed, waiting for the truth that had already begun to surface to finally be spoken aloud. The low rumble of the engines deepened, vibrating softly beneath the floor, but inside the cabin, no one seemed to register it anymore, because all attention had shifted to the quiet center of the moment, where truth hovered just beneath the surface, waiting to be named. And the man in uniform finally turned slightly, his voice calm, but carrying clearly through the stillness. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, not raising his tone, yet commanding every ear, every glance, every held breath, "We will be departing shortly, but before that, I would like to ensure everything is in order." His eyes moved briefly across the cabin, then settled back on Marcus with a respect that no longer needed to be hidden. "Mr. Reed," he continued, the name landing gently but with unmistakable weight, "we appreciate your patience." And the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, like a shift in gravity that everyone could feel at once. Victoria's expression froze, not in disbelief, but in recalculation, her mind moving quickly to reconcile what she had just heard with everything she had assumed only moments before. The name repeated silently in her thoughts, searching for recognition, for context, for meaning. And then it came, not all at once, but in fragments, headlines glimpsed in passing, interviews half remembered, a photograph from a business magazine, the founder who had redefined regional travel, The man who had built an airline from nothing into something that now carried thousands of passengers every day across the country. And as that realization settled, it did not explode. It sank, heavy and quiet, reshaping everything around it. The attendant's eyes widened just slightly, her posture shifting from uncertainty to something closer to awareness, her earlier hesitation now replaced with a careful stillness. As if she understood she was standing in the presence of something far beyond the situation she had tried to resolve. A murmur began to ripple softly through the rows behind them, not loud enough to break the atmosphere, but enough to signal that others were beginning to understand as well. Connecting the name, the moment, the man, Marcus did not react to the recognition, did not turn, did not acknowledge the shift unfolding around him. His gaze remained forward, calm, as if none of this changed who he was or how he carried himself. And that, more than anything, deepened the impact of the moment, because the power now visible had been present all along, unnoticed, unannounced, existing quietly beneath the surface of assumptions that had failed to see it. Victoria's hand moved slightly on the armrest, her fingers curling inward as if searching for something to hold on to. But there was nothing there, no certainty left to anchor her. Only the echo of her own words hanging in the space between them. And for the first time since she had spoken, she did not have a response. The cabin, once filled with quiet judgment, now held a different kind of silence, one shaped not by assumption, but by realization, by the unmistakable presence of truth finally stepping into the light. Victoria Caldwell had built her life on certainty, on the quiet belief that she understood how the world worked and where she stood within it. But as the name settled into the space around her, that certainty did not shatter. It unraveled, slowly and without mercy, thread by thread, leaving her exposed to a reality she had not prepared for. Her lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came, not because she lacked them, but because none of them fit anymore. None of them held the same weight they had just moments before. Her gaze shifted toward Marcus again, but this time it was different. No longer scanning, no longer judging, but searching, trying to reconcile the quiet man by the window with the presence that had just been revealed. And what unsettled her most was not the revelation itself, but the fact that nothing about him had changed. He had not straightened his posture, had not raised his voice, had not claimed the space that was now undeniably his. He simply remained as he had always been, composed, grounded, present. And that stillness carried more authority than anything she had tried to impose. The attendant stepped slightly closer now, her tone soft, respectful in a way that came naturally rather than out of obligation. "Mr. Reed, is there anything you need before departure?" she asked, and the question itself shifted the final balance in the cabin, making visible what had been invisible before. Marcus turned his head just enough to acknowledge her, his expression calm, almost thoughtful. "No. Thank you," he replied, his voice even, unhurried, as if the moment required nothing more than what it already held. Victoria inhaled slowly, her chest rising and falling in a measured rhythm that betrayed the effort it took to steady herself. Her hand moved from the armrest to her lap, fingers interlacing tightly for a brief second before loosening again. And then, almost imperceptibly, she leaned forward, the movement small, hesitant, a departure from the confidence that had defined her earlier presence. "Mr. Reed," she began, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge, and for a moment she paused, as if searching for the right way to begin again. I was not aware," she said finally, the words incomplete, insufficient, but all she could offer in that moment. Marcus did not turn immediately, his gaze still resting on the horizon beyond the window, where the last light of day stretched across the sky in soft gradients of gold and blue. And when he did respond, it was not with dismissal, not with correction, but with something far more disarming. "You were aware," he said gently, his voice steady. "Just not of me." And the truth of it settled into the space between them with quiet finality, leaving no room for argument, no space for retreat, only understanding. Victoria's eyes lowered slightly, her shoulders easing in a way that suggested not defeat, but recognition, a shift not imposed from outside, but unfolding from within and around them. The cabin remained silent, not with tension, but with something deeper, something closer to reflection, as if every person present had been drawn into the moment, not as spectators, but as witnesses to something that extended beyond a single exchange, something that lingered, that stayed, that asked to be remembered. The aircraft began to move with a slow, almost imperceptible roll, the wheels beneath the cabin humming softly as the runway lights stretched into long glowing lines outside the window, and inside, no one spoke, not because they were told to be quiet, but because something unspoken had settled among them, something that did not need to be interrupted. Marcus Reed sat as he had from the beginning, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady on the horizon where the last traces of daylight faded into the deepening blue of evening, the reflection of the cabin faintly visible in the glass, a quiet mirror of the moment that had just passed. Victoria Caldwell remained still beside him, her hands now resting loosely in her lap, no longer gripping, no longer directing, just present, her shoulders slightly lowered as if the weight she had carried without noticing had finally been set down. Her eyes moved once more toward Marcus, not searching this time, not questioning, but simply seeing, truly seeing, the man who had been there all along, unchanged by her words, untouched by her assumptions. The engines grew louder now, a steady, rising force that filled the space around them. Yet even that powerful sound did not break the silence that had formed inside, because it was no longer the silence of tension, but the silence of understanding, the kind that settles after something important has been revealed, the kind that lingers longer than any spoken apology. The man in uniform had stepped away, his role complete, leaving behind a space that no longer needed explanation. The attendant moved quietly down the aisle, her steps softer now, her presence more aware, as if she too carried a piece of what had unfolded, a quiet lesson that would follow her beyond this flight. The aircraft picked up speed, the ground outside blurring into motion, and for a brief moment, as the plane lifted from the runway, there was that familiar sensation of weightlessness, of leaving something behind while moving towards something unknown. And in that moment, Victoria closed her eyes just briefly, not in discomfort, but in reflection, the echo of her own voice